Everyone thinks they understand Netflix. You pay a monthly fee, you get shows and movies. Netflix takes that money, makes more shows, and wins because its shows are the best. Simple, obvious, and almost completely wrong. Because here is something strange. In 2025, Netflix made $45.2 billion. It earned $11 billion in profit. It became one of the most valuable media companies on earth. And in that same year, it did something no growth company is ever supposed to do. It stopped telling anyone how many customers it has. For over 20 years, the number of subscribers was the most important number in Netflix's world. Wall Street lived and died by it. Every 3 months, the entire stock market waited to see if Netflix added a few million more. And then, quietly, Netflix said, "We're not going to report that anymore." Think about how odd that is. A company obsessed with growth hiding its growth number at the exact moment it's making record profits. So what is Netflix actually hiding? And what is it really selling? Because it is clearly not just selling shows. That is the real story. And to understand it, we have to forget almost everything we think we know. The year is 1997. A man named Reed Hastings rents the movie Apollo 13. He forgets to return it. Weeks later, he gets hit with a late fee of about $40. He's annoyed. And in that moment of annoyance, an idea is born. What if renting movies had no late fees at all? What if you paid one monthly price and kept the movie as long as you liked? It's a great story, clean, emotional, easy to remember. There's just one problem. The people who were actually there have admitted it's more myth than fact. The real Netflix began as something far less romantic. A plan cooked up by Hastings and his co-founder, Mark Randolph, to sell or rent something through the mail using a brand new technology, the DVD.
But here's why the late fee story matters anyway. It hides the real insight. Because the genius of early Netflix was never about late fees. It was about a word almost no one noticed at the time. In 1999, Netflix stopped charging per rental. Instead, it offered one flat monthly price. Keep as many DVDs as you want. No due dates, no penalties. Just a small charge that hit your account automatically every single month. That tiny shift changed everything. A rental is a decision you make every time. A subscription is a decision you make once and then forget you made. And a payment you forget about is a payment that keeps coming. That is the first hidden gear in the machine. Netflix didn't sell you a movie. It sold you a habit you'd stop noticing. But a habit only works if the company survives long enough to build it. And in the year 2000, Netflix almost didn't.
Picture a meeting room in Dallas, Texas. On one side sits the leadership of Blockbuster, the most powerful video rental company on the planet. 9,000 stores, billions in revenue. On the other side sit two nervous men from a tiny startup that is losing money fast. Netflix offers to sell itself to Blockbuster for around $50 million. Blockbuster says no. According to the people in the room, they were nearly laughed out of the building. Why would the king of video rentals buy a struggling company that mailed out discs? That rejection looks like a joke today. Netflix is worth hundreds of billions. Blockbuster is gone. But the interesting question isn't, how did Blockbuster get it so wrong? The interesting question is, why couldn't Blockbuster simply crush Netflix? They had more money, more customers, more movies. If mailing DVDs was such a good idea, Blockbuster could have done it too. And they eventually tried. Here's what they couldn't escape. Blockbuster's business was built on stores. Every store meant rent, shelves, staff, electricity, and late fee income they didn't want to lose. Their entire money-making system depended on you driving to a physical location. To copy Netflix, Blockbuster would have to attack its own business.
Netflix had no stores to protect, and that reveals the second hidden gear. Netflix was built to be what analysts call asset light. It owned as little physical stuff as possible. And when you own almost nothing, you can grow almost infinitely, because adding one more customer barely costs you anything. Hold that idea in your mind. Adding one more customer costs almost nothing. Because that single sentence, more than any show, explains how Netflix became a money machine. But first, Netflix had to survive its own worst decision. By 2011, Netflix was a streaming star. It had jumped from mailing discs to letting you watch instantly over the internet. Subscribers loved it. The stock soared. Then, Reed Hastings made a move that nearly destroyed the company. He decided to split Netflix in two. The DVD service would become a separate business with a strange new name, Quickster. And at the same time, prices jumped by as much as 60% for people who wanted both discs and streaming. Customers revolted. Hundreds of thousands canceled. The stock collapsed, losing most of its value in a matter of months. It was one of the fastest falls from grace in modern business. Hastings backed down. Quickster died before it launched. But hidden inside this disaster was the most important decision Netflix ever made.
Netflix chose streaming as its future, even though streaming was at the time the worst business. The DVD service was profitable, streaming was expensive, and Netflix didn't own most of what it streamed. It was renting other companies' movies and shows, paying huge fees, at the mercy of studios that could pull their content at any moment. Netflix's leaders saw the trap. If they only rented other people's content, they would never truly control their future. The studios could raise prices, or worse, launch their own streaming services and cut Netflix off completely. So Netflix made a bet that sounded insane. It would start making its own shows. And to do that, it would spend money it didn't have. In 2013, Netflix released a political drama called House of Cards. It wasn't its first original, but it was the first big one, a signal to the world that Netflix wasn't just a pipe for other people's content anymore. It was a studio. And this is where the machine gets genuinely clever, because making your own shows costs enormous amounts of money up front. A single season can cost tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars. If Netflix counted all of that as a normal expense the year it spent it, the company would look like it was drowning in losses.
So Netflix does something most viewers never think about. It treats its shows and films the way an airline treats an airplane. When an airline buys a jet, it doesn't record the entire cost as one bad year. The jet will fly for decades, so the cost is spread out over its useful life. Netflix does the same thing with content. A show is an asset. Its costs get spread out, amortized. Over the years, people will actually watch it. The numbers are staggering. In 2025, Netflix spent about $17 billion in cash creating and licensing content. But on its official profit statement, it only counted about $16.4 billion as an expense that year. The difference sits on its balance sheet as a library, a stockpile of assets worth roughly $32 billion. But where does the cash to make all this content come from if the company is still growing? For years, the answer was simple, and few people talked about it openly. Netflix borrowed billions to fund its content while it grew. It was, in effect, buying its future audience on credit. Critics screamed that it was reckless, that it would collapse under its own borrowing. They were wrong. And to understand why, we need to look at the one thing Netflix built that no competitor could copy.
Ask most people what makes Netflix special, and they'll say the shows. Stranger Things, Squid Game, the big hits. But hits are not a moat. Every studio makes hits sometimes. What Netflix built is something invisible and far more powerful. It knows exactly what you will watch next. Every time you pause, skip, rewatch, or scroll past the title, Netflix records it. Multiply that by hundreds of millions of people watching billions of hours. In the second half of 2025 alone, Netflix members watched about 96 billion hours of content. That is not just entertainment. That is the largest running study of human attention ever built. Netflix uses this ocean of data for two things. First, it decides what to make. It doesn't guess which shows might work. It watches patterns across the entire planet and places smarter bets than almost anyone. Second, and more importantly, it decides what to show you. The rows of titles on your screen are not the same as your neighbors. They are custom built to keep you watching. And here is a psychology most people never notice. Netflix is not really fighting other streaming services for your attention. It is fighting a single enemy, the moment you consider canceling. Every design choice attacks that moment. Autoplay starts the next episode before you can decide to stop. The skip intro button removes the tiny friction that might make you walk away. The homepage is engineered so you never face an empty screen and think, there's nothing to watch, maybe I'll cancel. This is a battle against decision fatigue, the human tendency to give up when choosing feels like work. Netflix removes the choosing, so you keep watching, so you keep paying. The average Netflix account watches over 2 hours a day. That is not an accident. That is a machine tuned over billions of data points to turn a subscription into a reflex, and a reflex is very, very hard to cancel. Which brings us to the moment Netflix's whole strategy secretly changed. In early 2022, Netflix did something it hadn't done in more than a decade. It lost subscribers. Not a lot at first, about 200,000 in the first quarter, then nearly 1 million more in the second. For a company whose entire story was growth forever, it was an earthquake. The stock lost roughly 2/3 of its value that year. Reporters wrote that streaming was dying, that Netflix had peaked. Inside Netflix, though, something clicked. Leadership realized they had been telling the wrong story all along. They had trained everyone, investors, reporters, themselves, to care about one number, how many subscribers they had. But that number was hitting a ceiling. Almost everyone who wanted Netflix already had it. Many were even sharing one account across several homes for free. So Netflix asked a different question. Not how do we get more customers, but how do we get more money from the customers we already have? The answer came in 3 moves, and together they rebuilt the entire business. For years, Netflix had winked at password sharing. It once literally tweeted, "Love is sharing a password." Then, in 2023, the love ended. Netflix told users the account was for one household only. If your cousin in another city wanted in, someone had to pay. People predicted disaster, a revolt, mass cancellations. Instead, in the weeks after the US crackdown began, Netflix saw some of the biggest sign-up days in its history. Millions of freeloaders quietly became paying customers. It turned out that all those shared passwords weren't lost customers. They were an untapped goldmine. Netflix had simply been giving away money for years. Netflix, the company that built its brand on no commercials ever, launched a cheaper plan with ads. Critics called it a betrayal of everything Netflix stood for. But the logic was ruthless. A viewer who won't pay $18 a month might happily pay $8, and Netflix earns money twice from that person, once from their subscription and again from advertisers who want their attention. By late 2025, the ad tier reached around 190 million monthly viewers, and ad revenue blew past $1.5 billion, more than doubling in a single year. With a captive habit-formed audience, Netflix started nudging prices up. In the United States, the main ad-free plan climbed to about $18 a month. Few people canceled. When something is a daily reflex, a couple of extra dollars rarely breaks the habit. That is pricing power, the ability to charge more without losing your customers. And Netflix has it in a way almost no company does. Now, put the 3 moves together. More paying accounts from the crackdown, more money per account from ads and price hikes. Suddenly, the old subscriber number didn't even capture the real story anymore. 2 accounts could bring in wildly different amounts of money, depending on ads, plan, and price. So Netflix stopped reporting it. Not to hide weakness, but to force everyone to stop watching the old game and start watching the new one. The new game isn't how many people watch, it's how much each one is worth. So let's follow the money. Where does a single Netflix dollar actually go? Imagine your monthly payment. Roughly speaking, the biggest slice, often more than half, goes to content, making and licensing the shows and films. A meaningful chunk goes to technology and the massive computer systems that stream video flawlessly to hundreds of millions of screens at once. Some goes to marketing, and some to the everyday cost of running a global company. But here is the magic number. In 2025, Netflix kept about 29.5 cents of every dollar as operating profit. That is its operating margin, and it is extraordinary for a company that makes television. Traditional studios and networks often struggle to reach half of that. Why so high? Go back to that idea from the Blockbuster story. Adding one more customer costs almost nothing. Netflix spends billions to make a show like Squid Game, but once it exists, whether 10 million people watch it or 200 million people watch it, the cost to Netflix is nearly the same. The show is already made. Streaming it to one more person costs a rounding error. This is the beauty of a digital asset-light business. Costs are mostly fixed, revenue keeps climbing, and every new subscriber flows almost straight to the bottom line. That is how a company can spend $17 billion on content and still walk away with $11 billion in profit and $9.5 billion in free cash flow, real cash left over after everything is paid. That free cash flow changed the whole story. Remember the debt Netflix borrowed to fund its early content? Once the machine matured, Netflix wasn't borrowing to survive anymore. It was generating a river of cash. And a company drowning in cash starts to think bigger, much bigger, which leads to the strangest chapter of all. In December 2025, Netflix, the company that once mailed DVDs and got laughed out of Blockbuster, agreed to buy one of the oldest names in Hollywood, Warner Bros. Not a show, not a library, the studio itself, along with the HBO streaming business. The price tag was around $72 billion. To pay for it, Netflix lined up a loan so enormous it was reported as the largest bridge loan ever recorded, roughly $59 billion arranged from a group of banks. Stop and think about what this means. Netflix's original bet was that it didn't need old Hollywood. It would make its own content, control its own future, and leave the studios behind. Now, at the peak of its power, it was trying to buy old Hollywood outright. Why? Because the machine had reached its next frontier. Netflix wanted the one thing it still didn't have enough of: deep, permanent ownership of famous stories, the kind of characters and franchises people return to for decades. Owning the studio meant owning the IP forever, feeding both the subscription and the growing ad business. But the story doesn't end the way Netflix wanted. A rival, Paramount Skydance, refused to let Warner Bros. Go. It launched its own aggressive bid, an all-cash offer for the entire company. The two sides pushed prices higher and higher, and in February 2026, Warner's board decided Paramount's offer, at $31 a share, was the better deal. Netflix was given a few days to fight back, to raise its bid and win. And then it did something that revealed everything about how it thinks. It walked away. Netflix looked at the higher price, ran the numbers, and decided Warner Bros. Was no longer worth it. It refused to overpay, even for 100 years of Hollywood history. Paramount won the studio. Warner shareholders approved the deal a couple of months later, and Netflix collected a $2.8 billion breakup fee on the way out the door. The disruptor tried to buy the empire, lost the bidding war, and still walked away richer. That is not the behavior of a company in love with content. That is the behavior of a machine that only cares about one thing: the math. So let's return to the question we started with. Why does Netflix hide its subscriber number? What is it really selling? Here is the truth, now that we've seen the whole machine. Netflix was never in the business of selling movies and shows. Shows are just the bait. The real product, the thing Netflix has spent nearly 30 years perfecting, is the removal of a decision. It removed the decision to return a DVD. It removed the decision of what to watch. It removed the decision to click play next. And most importantly, it removed the decision to cancel by making watching so automatic, so woven into your evenings, that stopping never crosses your mind. Every gear we uncovered serves that single goal: the subscription that you forget you're paying, the asset-light design that lets it grow without limit, the debt-financed content library that keeps the shelves full, the algorithm that turns attention into habit, the password crackdown that captured the freeloaders, the ads and price hikes that squeeze more from a captive crowd, and now an advertising and IP empire being built on top of 325 million households that pay automatically every single month, mostly without thinking about it. That is why Netflix can hide its subscriber count,
because the number of customers was never the real machine. The real machine is the habit, and once the habit is built, the money follows on its own. Blockbuster thought it was in the business of renting movies. It was wrong, and it died. Netflix figured out that it was never really in the movie business at all. It's in the business of making sure you never decide